Imagine waking at dawn with a knot of regret lodged deep in your chest. The feeling colors your day with a dull ache and a steady nagging commentary on every choice. It is an intimate companion that visits all of us, and it often refuses to leave without answers. Regret shows up like a message that something went wrong and must be understood. It demands our attention in ways that joy and success rarely do, and that urgency is what makes regret uniquely poignant and philosophically important. Regret is not merely a bad feeling to be stamped out and forgotten by force. It is an evolved emotional signal designed to tell us that a past decision violated some internal value or external norm in meaningful ways. When understood correctly, regret functions like an internal alarm system pointing toward lessons that could prevent similar pain in the future. Philosophers and psychologists have both tried to name the purpose of regret, and they often converge on the idea that regret is a teacher disguised as a tormentor. The key difference between torment and teaching is how we respond to the feeling and whether we extract information from it instead of letting it erode our sense of agency. Not every pang of guilt earns the title of regret, and not every regret is useful in the same way. There is a crucial distinction between healthy regret that guides learning and unhealthy regret that traps people in endless rumination. Healthy regret motivates repair, informs future choices, and leads to behavioral change that reduces future harm. Unhealthy regret, by contrast, becomes a loop of self-reproach that erodes confidence and narrows cognitive flexibility. It often masquerades as moral rigor while secretly sabotaging the very improvements it claims to pursue, and understanding this divergence is essential for transformational growth. Healthy regret carries an undercurrent of possibility rather than merely pain and punishment. When you feel healthy regret, you tend to ask different questions focused on repair and learning instead of endless blame. Those questions transform the past into a source of information rather than a prison cell for your identity. Unhealthy regret insists that you become who you were at your worst forever, and it amplifies mistakes into definitions. The work of moving from unhealthy to healthy regret is largely a work of narrative revisioning and psychological reframing, which means it is both ethical and practical. To learn from regret, you must first listen to what it is actually telling you without immediate judgment. That requires separating the feeling from the story you immediately build around it, because stories escalate and distort the lessons that are present. Pause, breathe, and ask what specific choices caused this outcome and which of those choices you can realistically change in future situations. This method turns regret into a diagnostic tool rather than a verdict on your character, and that shift expands your capacity for growth. It also reframes accountability as a future-oriented practice focused on skill building instead of past punishment. Many people think that the purpose of regret is to make them suffer until they learn their lesson. But that is a punitive misunderstanding. Regret is imperfect precisely because human beings are imperfect, and it will often arrive with maximal negativity because evolution prizes error detection over comfort. The point is not to create endless suffering, but to use the discomfort as leverage for more informed decisions in the future. We must therefore ask what kind of learning we want from our regret, and whether our responses are proportional to the mistake made. When responses become disproportionate, they tend to produce collateral damage like shame, withdrawal, and avoidance, which undermine long-term well-being. Regret functions like a moral memory with cognitive muscles that can be strengthened through practice. Each reflective act adds a layer of context and turns raw emotion into structured insight that can inform future behavior. This process looks a lot like training. You recognize an error, analyze its mechanics, and rehearse alternative responses for next time. Practically speaking, this means creating simple routines that turn regret into planning sessions rather than punishments, and those routines might include journaling, discussion with a trusted friend, or concrete decision trees. The more methodical you become about extracting lessons, the less likely regret will degrade into paralyzing rumination. There is a point at which regret must be released because some aspects of the past are beyond repair. Letting go does not mean forgetting or pretending the harm did not happen, and it certainly does not mean evading responsibility. Letting go is an active, purposeful practice of acknowledging limits and redirecting energy into what can be influenced now. This practice recognizes the difference between what is within your control and what is not, and it is a philosophical cornerstone for emotional freedom. When you accept boundaries of control, regret loses much of its ability to torment because your efforts are focused on actionable improvements instead of impossible undoings. A simple yet radical tool for letting go involves concrete rituals of acknowledgement, followed by intentional transitions. For example, articulate the mistake in plain language, state what you would do differently, and then verbally declare a plan for forward movement. The ritual creates a psychological endpoint and gives your brain permission to convert narrative rehearsal into a new default. Rituals can be small and personal or structured and social, but they must include a forward-looking component that redirects attention away from endless replay. This act of deliberate closure is what differentiates healthy processing from repetitive anguish. Self-forgiveness is one of the most misunderstood practices in healing from regret, and many people conflate it with excusing harmful behavior. True self-forgiveness acknowledges harm and takes responsibility while refusing to let past actions define your ongoing worth. It is a courageous act that involves both moral honesty and compassionate reconnection with yourself. Psychological research suggests that self-forgiveness reduces stress and increases the likelihood of making reparative gestures when appropriate. It thus becomes not a negation of accountability, but a reinforcement of future-oriented responsibility. To practice self-forgiveness, you need a language that balances humility and kindness, and this requires concrete linguistic habits. Start sentences with what you did and what you learned instead of condemning descriptors about your identity that feel permanent. For instance, say I acted in a way that hurt someone, and I will make amends rather than I am a terrible person forever. These small shifts in phrasing restructure your cognitive map of the event and create pathways toward repair and growth. With repetition, the compassionate language reduces shame and increases clarity about actionable steps to make things better. The Stoics had a powerful and surprisingly modern way of approaching regret that can change how we relate to the past. They taught that the past cannot be changed, and that our energy is better spent on the present moment where choice remains. This philosophy does not deny feeling, but instead invites disciplined reflection and rational action without torment. Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus wrote extensively about accepting events beyond our control while focusing on internal faculties we could cultivate. Their practice encourages turning regret into assessment and strategic improvement rather than perpetual lamentation. One Stoic technique involves visualizing the worst possible outcome and then rehearsing how you would respond with virtue and resilience. This premeditation of adversity reduces the power of unexpected regret because you have already exercised moral choices in imagination. The exercise strengthens foresight and prepares the mind for future moments where similar mistakes might arise. By internalizing responses ahead of time, regret becomes less of a sucker punch and more of a familiar, manageable sensation that signals useful corrections. Over time, this training reduces reactive decision-making and increases deliberate action. There is a moral architecture that organizes different types of regret, and identifying their categories can make them easier to handle. Some regrets are moral, rooted in harm toward others, while others are prudential, related to missed opportunities or poor planning. Each category requires a different kind of response. Apology and repair for moral regret, planning and skill development for prudential regret. Treating regret like a taxonomy helps you allocate appropriate remedies instead of applying blanket punishments to a range of different problems. This method reduces the risk of overgeneralizing regret into an identity-shaping narrative that misguides personal reform. Practical tools for dealing with regret start with structured reflection exercises that are surprisingly simple to use. The what, so what, now what model converts raw feelings into disciplined inquiry by asking what happened, why it mattered, and what concrete next steps are possible. This framework removes the emotional fog and forces specific choices, rather than generalized self-condemnation. Other practical tools include time-limited rumination, scheduled worry periods, and redirective action plans that translate insight into behavior. These approaches work because they honor the information that regret provides while imposing boundaries that prevent it from spiraling into chronic distress. Another useful strategy is to externalize the regret through writing or conversation so you can interact with it objectively. When you articulate the mistake in a letter or speak it aloud to a trusted person, the raw emotional charge dissipates and clarity increases. This externalization often reveals hidden assumptions and distorted narratives that kept the regret alive in the first place. Choosing a trusted listener or a private journal converts private torment into social or recorded evidence that can be interrogated. That interrogation reveals patterns of reasoning that either deserve correction or should be released entirely. We can also use the power of temporal perspective to diminish the emotional intensity of regret by imagining our life decades from now. When you place a mistake within the context of a larger arc of your life, the event often loses disproportionate emotional weight. This does not trivialize harm, but it can prevent a single episode from defining an entire identity. Temporal reframing builds psychological resilience because it reminds us that lives are long and patterns can change with consistent effort. The future vantage point encourages planning and patience instead of immediate self-punishment. Forgiveness often requires a social component when the regret involves other people, and repairing relationships can be a practical path to emotional healing. Sincere apologies accompanied by concrete reparative actions restore trust more effectively than vague remorse. The process of repair also gives you experiential data about how your actions affect others and how to behave differently in future situations. Even when others refuse to forgive, the act of attempting repair clarifies your values and preserves your dignity, which is crucial for moving forward. The attempt itself is educational and often frees you from repetitive internal rehearsal that otherwise prolongs suffering. There will be moments when practical repair is impossible, and those situations demand a different kind of courageous acceptance. Acceptance in this context is not surrender to injustice, but recognition of irrevocable facts coupled with a commitment to live differently going forward. This blend of realism and resolve reduces suffering while honoring what cannot be undone. Philosophically, acceptance is an active stance aimed at creating meaning out of loss instead of erasing it by denial. Practically, this stance translates into lifestyle changes, boundary setting, and focused efforts to avoid repeating harmful patterns. A surprisingly effective practice for combating unhealthy regret is cultivating deliberate gratitude for the constraints and lessons that mistakes provide. Gratitude does not mean rejoicing in error, but it does acknowledge that mistakes are often the raw material of growth. This mentality reframes regret as a painful but fertile ground where new habits and wisdom can take root. Over time, grateful reflection softens the judgmental tone of regret and replaces it with curiosity and possibility. When combined with disciplined action, gratitude becomes fuel for transformation rather than a sentimental bomb that avoids real change. Mental contrasting is another technique that pairs vivid visualization of a desired future with honest appraisal of obstacles, including past mistakes. Imagine the future you want, then lay the reality of past regret next to it, and finally design micro-steps that bridge the gap. This method turns regret into a roadmap rather than a tombstone for potential. Micro steps reduce overwhelm by making change manageable and measurable, and they produce incremental wins that rewrite neural pathways. Consistent small actions are often more transformative than sporadic bursts of contrition because they recalibrate habits over time. There is also therapeutic value in recognizing the role of identity in magnifying regret, especially when you equate mistakes with a fixed self. Identity-based rumination turns singular events into eternal labels, and that pattern is particularly corrosive. Shifting to a growth identity, where mistakes are expected and informative, undermines the narrative power of regret and promotes resilience. Adopting a growth identity takes practice and evidence, and it thrives on honest feedback and incremental competence building. Over time, your sense of self becomes closer to a dynamic project than a static verdict, which changes how regret functions in your life. We live in a cultural moment that amplifies regret through social media, highlight reels, and comparative life narratives that distort reality. Seeing curated versions of other people's lives encourages unrealistic standards and fuels avoidant or compensatory behaviors that create more regret. Being aware of this amplification effect helps you apply filters to social input and focus on personal metrics of meaningful progress. Reducing exposure to comparison triggers, cultivating private milestones, and measuring growth by internal standards are practical counters to socially induced regret. These habits preserve psychological bandwidth for genuine learning instead of reactive self-flagellation. Sometimes regret is tightly woven with grief, and disentangling the two requires tenderness and time rather than quick fixes. Grief involves loss and often lacks a clear avenue for repair, while regret implies things you might have changed through different choices. Recognizing when you are grieving versus when you are tasked with making amends clarifies the kind of support and action you need. Therapeutic approaches that respect both grief and regret tend to combine mourning rituals with practical planning when possible. This integrated approach honors complexity and prevents simplistic solutions that fail to address deeper emotional truth. As you practice these tools, you will notice a pattern where regret becomes less chaotic and more instructive over time. The emotional intensity will likely decrease, but the informational content will become sharper as your reflection routines extract more precise lessons. That sharpening leads to better decisions and a calmer mind because the same mistakes become fewer and less severe. This is not a cure-all promise, but a realistic expectation grounded in habit formation and cognitive science. The slow accrual of small improvements is the essential narrative of turning regret into wisdom. Philosophically, transforming regret reframes the human condition. We are fallible beings whose errors illuminate the path to virtue when we are willing to learn. This idea connects ancient ethical thought with modern psychology and offers a hopeful narrative for anyone who has been haunted by past choices. Regret becomes not an indictment but a source of moral and practical refinement. The modern relevance is profound because we now have tools and frameworks that past thinkers could only imagine, and those tools allow us to systematize learning from error. When combined with compassion and discipline, these practices create lives that are more adaptive, meaningful. Before we finish, it matters to remember that lament without action solidifies suffering, while action without reflection repeats mistakes in different outfits. The art of dealing with regret lies in balancing feeling and doing with honest accountability. When those elements are in tension, you get learning. When they are misaligned, you get stagnation and shame. So practice honest reflection, pursue repair when appropriate, accept what cannot be changed, and cultivate a future-oriented plan that honors your values. These steps create a reliable compass for navigating the moral terrain of everyday life and transforming regret into a resource. In the end, regret can either be the anchor that keeps you tethered to your worst stories or the keel that steadies your ship as you sail forward. The difference between those outcomes is determined by how you interpret the feeling, whom you talk to about it, and what concrete steps you take afterward. This is an invitation to treat regret neither as destiny nor as denial, but as actionable information. Human life is long and full of imperfect choices, and the philosophy of regret offers a humane roadmap for making those choices matter constructively. If this video shifted your perspective, try one of the practical exercises we discussed and notice how your relationship with regret changes over time. If this gave you a new perspective, consider subscribing for more videos that blend philosophy and practical psychology in calm cinematic essays. Share a regret that taught you something meaningful in the comments if you feel comfortable doing so, because collective conversation helps us learn faster. And remember that transforming regret is a slow art rather than an overnight miracle. Thank you for watching and for allowing yourself to think about the past with more kindness and strategy. If this video helped, hit subscribe and join the community that chooses learning over lingering sorrow. Post-credits note, create a personal ritual to consolidate your insights by writing a short letter to your past self. In that letter, acknowledge the mistake, name the lesson learned, and promise one concrete micro-step you will take in the next week to avoid repeating it. Seal the letter, date it, and store it as a marker of your ongoing development and commitment. This ritual becomes a small historical artifact that tracks your relationship with regret and your capacity to grow over time. Revisit it months later to witness change and to reinforce the lesson that regret, when well handled, becomes a teacher rather than a jailer. Another practical tip is to set a weekly learning from regret session that lasts no longer than 30 minutes. Use structured prompts like, "What happened? What did I miss? And what will I do next time?" to extract clear lessons without falling into emotional replay. Limiting time prevents the session from becoming an emotional sinkhole and turns it into a productive habit. Treating reflection as an appointment respects both the importance of learning and the necessity of restoring emotional equilibrium. Over weeks, this habit builds an archive of lessons that materially changes future outcomes. For those who struggle with intense chronic regret, professional help can be a decisive turning point rather than a last resort. Therapists trained in cognitive behavioral techniques and narrative therapies provide tools for restructuring harmful narratives and developing actionable plans. Seeking help is an act of courage that acknowledges complexity and leverages expertise for better outcomes. Therapy accelerates learning because it externalizes internal patterns and gives you tools to experiment with new behaviors in a safe context. If regret is interfering with daily functioning, professional support is a responsible and effective choice. Finally, keep in mind that regret can be an ethical teacher that expands compassion for others because we all make mistakes. When we learn to treat our own errors with humane reflection, we become more apt to offer forgiveness and realistic expectations to the people around us. This ripple effect turns personal transformation into social healing and creates communities that are more resilient and generous. The philosophy of regret is therefore not merely personal therapy, but civic cultivation of wiser, kinder human interactions. Ending the cycle of punitive regret in one heart contributes to a cultural shift toward repair, humility, and shared growth. If you take nothing else from this video, remember this: regret is a signal, not a sentence, and the meaning you assign to it determines whether you are freed or fettered. Respond with curiosity, repair where possible, accept what cannot be changed, and plan concrete steps that align with your values. These choices convert regret into a faithful compass rather than an endless anchor. If this perspective resonated with you, hit subscribe and consider sharing one step you will take this week toward transforming a past mistake into future wisdom. Thank you for watching and for daring to turn regret into a better life.